Have you ever wondered why ancient Egyptians held the Ankh as the most sacred symbol of all creation and why they believed it contained the hidden code to eternal prosperity that flows like the Nile River itself through the consciousness of those who understand its deeper meaning? Tonight, while you rest, I will share with you the lost teaching that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered in 1925 when she received a profound vision that changed not only her own life, but the lives of thousands who learned what I am about to reveal to you now. The Ankh is not merely a symbol carved in stone or worn as jewelry, but a living, breathing law of the universe that governs how abundance flows from the invisible realm into physical manifestation through cycles of death and rebirth that happen every moment of every day. When you understand this law and align your consciousness with its eternal rhythm, you become a natural receiver of prosperity that flows to you as naturally as your own heartbeat. But before I explain the deeper mechanics of this ancient code, let me share with you the story of a woman whose life was transformed in exactly 48 hours when she first encountered the true power of the Ankh Law. And you will see how this same transformation awaits you as you listen to these words tonight. Her name was Evelyn Richardson, and she was 53 years old when she walked into the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City on a cold Tuesday morning in February at exactly 9:15. Evelyn had driven the 2-hour journey from her small apartment in Albany because she was facing the most desperate financial crisis of her entire life. 3 months earlier, her husband of 28 years had passed away suddenly from a heart attack, leaving her with medical bills totaling $47,812 and a mortgage she could no longer afford on her part-time income as a substitute teacher. The morning was bitter cold with snow falling steadily outside, and the museum felt like a sanctuary of warmth and quiet beauty. Evelyn had come not for entertainment, but for solace, because she had always found peace among ancient artifacts that reminded her there was something larger and more enduring than her immediate troubles. She wore her worn brown wool coat that smelled faintly of mothballs, and her hands were cold even inside her thin knitted gloves. As she wandered through the Egyptian wing, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her grief and financial terror, she found herself standing before a glass case containing a collection of golden Ankh replicas from the tomb of a high priestess. The card beside the case explained that the Ankh represented the key to eternal life and was believed by ancient Egyptians to unlock the secrets of divine abundance. Something about the graceful curve of the symbol's upper loop connecting to the strong vertical line below drew her attention in a way she had never experienced before. Without thinking, she placed her gloved hand against the cool glass directly over the largest Ankh and whispered a desperate prayer that came from the deepest place in her heart. She said, "Please, if there is any power in this ancient symbol, please help me find a way through this darkness because I do not know how I will survive." At that exact moment, something shifted inside her consciousness, like a door opening in a room she never knew existed. She felt a strange warmth spreading from her palm through the glass and into her entire body, accompanied by a voice that seemed to speak not to her ears, but directly into her soul. The voice said clearly and unmistakably, "The Ankh lives within you, and you live within the Ankh, and what you seek is already seeking you through the eternal law of circulation." Evelyn stood there for what felt like hours, but was actually only 17 minutes according to the museum clock she glanced at later. During those 17 minutes, she experienced a profound inner knowing that her financial crisis was not a punishment or a permanent condition, but rather a necessary death that would birth something far greater than anything she had lost. She understood somehow that the Ankh represented the perfect balance between releasing what no longer served and receiving what was always meant to be hers. When she finally moved away from the display case, she felt different in a way she could not yet explain. That night she fell asleep holding the image of the golden Ankh in her mind and speaking the words the voice had shared with her. She repeated, "The Ankh lives within me, and I live within the Ankh, and what I seek is already seeking me through the eternal law of circulation." The next morning at 8:43, her phone rang with a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer representing her husband's estranged brother who had died intestate in California 3 weeks earlier. Because her husband had been the only surviving relative, she was now the sole heir to an estate valued at $234,700, including a small house in San Diego that could be sold immediately. But that was not the end of the story. That same afternoon at 2:27, she received another call from the principal of the school district where she had been substitute teaching. A full-time position had suddenly become available due to an unexpected retirement, and they wanted to offer her a permanent contract with full benefits starting immediately. The salary was exactly $56,400 per year, which was more than double what she had been earning. By Thursday evening, exactly 48 hours after her encounter with the Ankh at the museum, Evelyn found herself sitting in her kitchen holding 2 checks that completely solved her financial crisis and created a foundation for long-term security she had never imagined possible. But more importantly, she understood that these external changes were simply the visible manifestation of an internal transformation that had occurred the moment she aligned herself with the Ankh Law. She later told me that she realized the desperate financial pressure had been necessary to strip away her old identity as someone who struggled and worried about money, so that she could be reborn into her true identity as someone who naturally receives abundance through the eternal circulation of divine supply. The Ankh had taught her that every ending contains within it the seed of a new beginning, and every loss creates space for something greater to emerge. This story demonstrates the profound truth that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered about the Ankh Law. And tonight I will share with you not only how this law works, but how you can activate it in your own life while you sleep. But first, I need to ask you to do something that will anchor this teaching in your consciousness and create a powerful field of manifestation for everyone who is listening. If this teaching resonates with you, and if you feel you were guided here tonight, then touch the subscribe button now. And it is not for me, but it is so that you receive each new teaching from Florence Scovel Shinn at the exact moment your soul needs it most. When you subscribe, you join a community of souls who are committed to living according to spiritual law, rather than the limitations of material appearance. And in the comments, write only these 3 words, which are, "I am receiving now," and this is not an affirmation, but a decree. And when you write these words, you activate the collective witness of thousands of souls who write these same words, and the field strengthens for everyone. The power of the Ankh Law multiplies when it is witnessed and acknowledged by others who understand its truth. If you choose not to do this right now, that is perfectly fine, and your path is your own. But know that this is the moment of greatest power, when the teaching is fresh in your consciousness and your heart is open to receive. So do it if you feel aligned, because these simple actions create an energetic foundation for everything that follows. Now you can relax completely, and you do not need to do anything else except listen and receive. Everything I will share enters your consciousness while you rest, and your subconscious mind is awake and absorbing every word, even if your conscious mind drifts into sleep. The Ankh works especially powerfully during sleep, because sleep itself is a form of death, and awakening is a form of rebirth, and this cycle aligns perfectly with the eternal law of circulation that governs all manifestation. If you fall asleep in the middle of this teaching, that is perfect, because when you wake, the seed will already be planted deep in your subconscious, and it will begin to grow according to its own divine timing. Your only job is to allow and receive and trust that something far greater than your conscious mind is orchestrating this entire experience for your highest good. The ancient Egyptians understood that the most profound transformations happen not through effort, but through surrender to the natural cycles of death and rebirth that govern all of life. Tonight, you are entering such a cycle, and by morning, you will emerge as someone new. And what you are about to discover will change not only how you think about prosperity, but how you experience your own divine nature. In the spring of 1925, Florence Scovel Shinn was 57 years old and living in a small apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where she worked as a spiritual teacher and metaphysical counselor. She had already written her first book, The Game of Life and How to Play It. But she was struggling financially, and often wondered if she truly understood the deeper mysteries she was attempting to teach others about manifestation and divine supply. Florence had always been drawn to ancient wisdom traditions and spent many evenings studying Egyptian mythology and symbolism in the dim light of her small reading lamp. She was particularly fascinated by the Ankh symbol, which appeared throughout Egyptian art and religious texts, but whose deeper meaning seemed to elude most scholars who interpreted it simply as a representation of life or immortality. On the night of May 15th at approximately 11:37, Florence fell into a deep sleep while reading a translation of ancient Egyptian prayers by candlelight. What happened next would transform not only her understanding of prosperity consciousness, but her entire spiritual teaching for the remainder of her life. In her dream, Florence found herself standing in a vast temple chamber lit by flickering torches, whose smoke carried the scent of frankincense and myrrh. The walls were covered with hieroglyphs that seemed to pulse with golden light, and before her stood a tall figure dressed in white linen robes with the head covering of an Egyptian high priest. His presence radiated an authority and wisdom that she had never encountered even in her deepest meditative states. The priest spoke to her in a voice that resonated through the chamber like the sound of distant thunder. He said, "You have been called here to receive the true teaching of the Ankh, which is not a symbol of life, but the actual law by which divine substance circulates through the consciousness of mortals." Most people see the Ankh and think it represents something external to themselves, but it is actually the pattern of their own divine nature when properly understood and activated. Florence felt her consciousness expanding as the priest continued speaking. He explained that the upper oval of the Ankh represents the infinite source of divine supply that exists beyond all material limitation. This source is not separate from human consciousness, but is actually the deepest level of consciousness itself, where individual awareness merges with universal abundance. The horizontal line represents the present moment, where divine supply intersects with human need, and the vertical line represents the grounding of spiritual truth into material manifestation. But the most important teaching the priest shared was about the circulation principle that the Ankh represents. He said the law of circulation means that divine supply must flow through you, not to you. And this flow requires both receiving and releasing in an eternal rhythm that mirrors the cycles of nature itself. When you hold on to anything, whether it is money or relationships or ideas or even spiritual concepts, you stop the circulation and create the very lack you fear. The priest then showed Florence a vision of how this circulation works in practical terms. She saw streams of golden light flowing from the infinite source through the consciousness of individuals who understood the Ankh Law, and then out into the world through their giving and sharing and service. But she also saw how fear and greed and attachment created blockages in this flow that caused the light to stagnate and diminish until there was barely a trickle reaching those who needed it most. He explained that the ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids and created one of the most prosperous civilizations in human history understood this circulation principle perfectly. They knew that true wealth comes not from accumulating and hoarding, but from becoming a clear channel through which divine abundance can flow to bless not only themselves, but everyone whose life they touch. Florence asked the priest how one activates this circulation in practical terms, and he smiled with infinite compassion. He said the activation happens through what you call decree, which is not mere positive thinking, but the authoritative declaration of spiritual law. When you speak the Ankh decree with full understanding and conviction, you align your entire being with the circulation principle, and divine supply begins to flow through you as naturally as blood flows through your veins. The decree he taught her was simple but profound. I am the eternal circulation of divine supply. I receive without limit and I give without fear. Through me, abundance flows to bless all life. I am the Ankh and the Ankh is me. He instructed her to speak this decree every night before sleep, when the conscious mind relaxes its grip and allows the subconscious to be reprogrammed according to spiritual law rather than material appearance. But the priest also warned Florence about the greatest obstacle to activating the Ankh Law, which is the ego's resistance to the circulation principle. He said the human ego wants to accumulate and control and possess because it believes in separation and scarcity. The ego does not understand that giving and receiving are one movement in consciousness, and that the more freely divine supply flows through you, the more abundant your own life becomes. He told her that the Ankh teaching must be shared with others, not for personal gain, but because the circulation principle is strengthened when more people understand and practice it. When a community of souls lives according to the Ankh Law, they create a collective field of abundance that lifts everyone to a higher level of manifestation and demonstration. Florence awoke from this dream at exactly 4:15 in the morning, with every detail crystal clear in her memory. She immediately wrote down everything the priest had shared and began applying the Ankh decree in her own life that very night. Within 6 weeks, she had received 3 unexpected sources of income, including a publishing contract for her second book, and invitations to teach workshops in cities across the country. But more importantly, Florence discovered that when she shared the Ankh teaching with her students and clients, their own manifestations accelerated dramatically. She realized that she had been given this ancient wisdom not for herself alone, but to help restore the circulation principle to a world that had forgotten how divine abundance actually works. The Ankh Law that Florence received in this profound dream teaches us that prosperity is not something we attract or create through techniques and strategies, but something we allow through alignment with the eternal circulation of divine supply. The Ankh is not a symbol but a law, and this law operates whether we understand it or not. But when we align our consciousness with it consciously, the results are swift and powerful. This circulation principle explains why some people seem to effortlessly attract abundance, while others struggle despite their best efforts. Those who understand the Ankh Law know that they are not separate from the source of supply, but are actually expressions of that source in human form. They receive without guilt and give without fear, because they know that divine supply is infinite, and that their role is simply to be a clear channel through which it flows. While you rest tonight, this same circulation principle is activating in your consciousness. You do not need to understand it mentally or believe in it emotionally. You simply need to allow it to work through you. Your subconscious mind is already beginning to align with the rhythm of divine circulation, and by morning, you will find yourself naturally open to receiving in ways you never expected. The teaching that Florence Scovel Shinn received about the Ankh is not ancient history, but a living spiritual law that operates in your life right now. As you continue to listen and allow these words to penetrate your consciousness, you are activating the same circulation principle that transformed her life and the lives of countless others who have learned to live according to spiritual law rather than material appearance. To truly understand how the Ankh Law operates in your consciousness, we must examine each part of this sacred symbol as Florence Scovel Shinn learned to interpret it through her deep study of ancient Egyptian wisdom and her own direct spiritual experience. The Ankh is not a random design, but a precise map of how divine consciousness organizes itself to create material manifestation through the interplay of receiving, releasing, and circulating spiritual substance. The upper oval of the Ankh represents what the ancient Egyptians called the infinite source, or the eternal wellspring from which all manifestation arises. This is not a place or a thing, but a level of consciousness that exists beyond all limitation and contains within itself every possibility that could ever be expressed in the material world. Florence Scovel Shinn understood this to be what she called the divine mind, where your true supply already exists in perfect form, waiting to be recognized and received. When you place your attention on the upper oval of the Ankh, you are training your consciousness to identify with the infinite rather than the finite, with the eternal rather than the temporary, with the source rather than the effect. This identification is crucial because, as Florence taught, you cannot demonstrate what you do not first accept as already belonging to you in divine mind. The upper oval reminds you that your supply does not come from people or circumstances or economic conditions, but from the inexhaustible source that exists within your own divine nature. But here is where most people make a fundamental error in their understanding of prosperity consciousness. They try to connect directly with the infinite source through willpower or visualization or positive thinking without understanding that there must be a proper alignment and circulation for divine supply to manifest in material form. The upper oval alone is not enough. There must also be the intersection and grounding that the lower portion of the Ankh represents. Let me share with you the remarkable story of Kenneth Morrison, who was 61 years old when he first learned about the spiritual anatomy of the Ankh and how focusing specifically on the upper oval transformed his financial circumstances in ways that seemed miraculous to those who witnessed his demonstration. Kenneth lived in Portland, Oregon, where he had worked for 34 years as an insurance adjuster before being laid off during a company restructuring when he was 59. For 2 years, he had struggled to find employment in his field, facing age discrimination and mounting financial pressure as his savings dwindled and his unemployment benefits expired. By the time he discovered the Ankh teaching through one of Florence Scovel Shinn's books, he had exactly $1,237 remaining in his checking account and no prospects for income. Kenneth was a methodical man who approached spiritual study with the same careful attention to detail that had made him successful in his insurance career. When he read about the upper oval of the Ankh representing the infinite source, he decided to spend 1 hour each evening before sleep, focused exclusively on expanding his identification with this limitless aspect of his own consciousness. He would lie in bed with his eyes closed and visualize the upper oval of the Ankh as a golden doorway that grew larger and more luminous each time he breathed in. As the oval expanded in his imagination, he would repeat silently, "I am not Kenneth, the unemployed insurance adjuster. I am the infinite source of divine supply expressing itself as Kenneth. I am not limited by age or circumstances or economic conditions. I am the eternal wellspring of all abundance." At first, this practice felt strange and artificial because his rational mind kept interrupting with thoughts about his dwindling bank account and the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table. But Kenneth persisted with the discipline he had learned through decades of detailed investigative work, and gradually something began to shift in his consciousness. After 2 weeks of this nightly practice, Kenneth noticed that his dreams had become unusually vivid and often involved scenes of abundance and prosperity that left him feeling hopeful and energized upon waking. More importantly, his daytime anxiety about money had begun to diminish, and he found himself feeling genuinely peaceful even while reviewing his financial situation. On the morning of May 23rd, exactly 18 days after he began the upper oval practice, Kenneth received a phone call at 7:45 from a man named David Chen, who introduced himself as the owner of a consulting firm that specialized in insurance fraud investigation. David explained that he had gotten Kenneth's name from a former colleague who had described him as the most thorough and insightful adjuster in the Pacific Northwest. David told Kenneth that his company had just secured a major contract with 3 regional insurance companies to investigate a complex pattern of suspicious claims that appeared to be connected across multiple states. He needed someone with Kenneth's specific expertise and experience to lead the investigation team, and he was prepared to offer a 6-month contract at a rate of $8,500 per month, with the possibility of extension if the work progressed successfully. Kenneth accepted the position immediately, and when he reported for work the following Monday, he discovered that David Chen had been searching for someone with his exact qualifications for over 4 months. David explained that he had interviewed dozens of candidates, but none had the combination of analytical skills, investigative experience, and intuitive perception that Kenneth demonstrated during their initial conversation. The fraud investigation that Kenneth led uncovered a sophisticated scheme involving fraudulent medical claims worth over $2.7 million, resulting in criminal convictions and substantial recovery for the insurance companies involved. His work was so exceptional that all 3 client companies requested that David's firm retain Kenneth permanently, and he was offered a full-time position as senior investigative consultant at an annual salary of $96,000. But Kenneth understood that this dramatic transformation was not simply a matter of lucky timing or professional networking. Through his practice with the upper oval of the Ankh, he had shifted his identity from someone who was unemployed and struggling to someone who was connected to infinite source and naturally receiving divine supply. The external circumstances had changed to match his internal transformation. Kenneth later said that the most important insight from his experience was realizing that the infinite source is not something separate from his own consciousness that he had to somehow access or convince to help him. The upper oval of the Ankh had taught him that he is an expression of infinite source and that his role is simply to remember and accept this truth rather than trying to create or attract prosperity from the outside. This understanding of the upper oval as representing your own infinite nature rather than some external source of supply is crucial to activating the Ankh Law in your life. When you meditate on the upper oval, you are not trying to connect with something outside yourself. You are remembering what you actually are beneath all the temporary identities and circumstances that seem to define you. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that every person is individualized divine consciousness and therefore has access to all the wisdom power and substance that exist in universal mind. The upper oval of the Ankh serves as a reminder that your true identity is unlimited and that any experience of lack or limitation is simply a temporary forgetting of your divine nature. Tonight, as you rest and allow your conscious mind to relax its grip on material appearances, your subconscious is naturally aligning with the infinite source that the upper oval represents. You do not need to try to make this happen or visualize specific outcomes. You simply need to allow the truth of your unlimited nature to emerge from beneath the layers of conditioning that have taught you to identify with limitation. The horizontal line of the Ankh represents the present moment where infinite possibility intersects with material manifestation. This is the crucial point where divine supply moves from the realm of pure potential into actual experience, and it requires your conscious participation through what Florence called treatment or decree. When you understand that you are the upper oval expressing itself through the intersection of the horizontal line, you become a willing participant in the manifestation process rather than someone who is hoping or trying to get something from a source outside yourself. This shift in understanding changes everything about how prosperity flows into your life, because you are no longer operating from separation, but from unity consciousness. The vertical line of the Ankh represents the grounding of spiritual truth into material form, and this is where many people experience resistance because the ego wants immediate visible results, while spiritual law operates according to divine timing rather than human impatience. But when you truly understand that you are the entire Ankh expressing itself as your human experience, you learn to trust the process and allow the manifestation to unfold naturally. At the very center of the Ankh, where the oval meets the cross, there exists what Florence Scovel Shinn called the point of intersection, and this represents the most crucial aspect of the entire Ankh Law, because it is here that the infinite realm of divine possibility merges with the finite realm of human experience through a process that requires both death and rebirth in every moment. This intersection point is not a physical location, but a state of consciousness where you release your attachment to how you think things should manifest and surrender to the divine intelligence that knows exactly how to bring your highest good into material form. It is the place where human will yields to divine will and where personal desire transforms into spiritual receptivity. The ancient Egyptians understood that all manifestation requires a form of death, because new life can only emerge when old patterns and identities are allowed to dissolve. This is why they associated the Ankh with eternal life, not because it prevents death, but because it reveals that death and rebirth are the eternal rhythm through which consciousness expands and expresses itself in ever greater forms of beauty and abundance. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered that most people resist the death aspect of the Ankh Law because they want to add prosperity to their existing identity, rather than allowing their identity to be transformed by the prosperity consciousness that wants to emerge through them. They want to become wealthy without becoming different, and this resistance blocks the very circulation they are trying to activate. Let me share with you the profound story of Joyce Hamilton, who was 57 years old when she learned about the intersection point of the Ankh and how her willingness to die daily to her old identity allowed her to experience a level of prosperity that exceeded anything she had ever imagined possible. Joyce lived in Sacramento, California, where she had worked for 23 years as an office manager for a small accounting firm until the company was sold to a larger corporation that eliminated her position as part of their efficiency restructuring. At 57, she found herself unemployed for the first time since college and facing the reality that most employers were reluctant to hire someone her age for management positions. For 6 months, Joyce applied for similar positions throughout Northern California, but received only 3 interviews and no job offers. Her severance package had provided some financial cushion, but by February she was facing the prospect of having to take a minimum wage retail job just to pay her basic expenses. She felt humiliated and defeated and struggled with depression that made it difficult to maintain the optimistic attitude that career counselors insisted was essential for successful job searching. Joyce had always considered herself a spiritual person and had read several of Florence Scovel Shinn's books over the years, but she had never understood the deeper implications of the teachings about death and rebirth. She had interpreted them as metaphorical concepts rather than practical instructions for transformation. But one evening, while reading about the Ankh Law in one of Florence's later writings, Joyce encountered a passage that stopped her completely. Florence had written that the intersection point of the Ankh requires what she called conscious death, which means deliberately releasing your attachment to who you think you are so that who you really are can emerge without resistance. Joyce realized that she had been trying to find another job that would allow her to maintain her identity as Joyce the office manager, rather than being open to discovering what new identity wanted to emerge through her at this stage of her life. She had been clinging to her old professional role because it felt safe and familiar, even though it was clearly no longer serving her highest good. That night, Joyce decided to practice what Florence called conscious death before sleep. She lay in bed and systematically released her attachment to being an office manager, her attachment to needing a specific type of job, her attachment to earning a particular salary, and even her attachment to working in an office environment at all. As she released each attachment, Joyce spoke the words, "I die to this limitation, and I am reborn to infinite possibility." She continued this process until she felt completely empty of all preconceived ideas about what her work life should look like. In that emptiness, she experienced a profound peace and a sense of anticipation, as if something wonderful was waiting to be born through her surrender. Joyce continued this conscious death practice every night for 21 consecutive days. Each evening, she would identify any attachment or expectation that had arisen during the day and consciously release it before sleep. She noticed that her anxiety about unemployment began to diminish and was replaced by a quiet excitement about what might emerge from this period of dissolution. On the 22nd day, Joyce received a phone call from her former college roommate, Linda, who lived in Phoenix, Arizona. Linda explained that she had started a business helping seniors downsize and organize their homes for retirement transitions, and the demand had grown so rapidly that she needed a partner to expand into Northern California. Linda offered Joyce a 50% partnership in the business, which would involve traveling to clients' homes and providing comprehensive services, including sorting and organizing possessions, coordinating estate sales, and helping families navigate the emotional challenges of major life transitions. The income potential was significantly higher than her previous office job, and the work would utilize not only her organizational skills, but also her natural empathy and ability to guide people through difficult changes. Joyce accepted the partnership immediately, and within 3 months, their business had expanded to include 12 other consultants, serving clients throughout California and Nevada. Joyce discovered that her own experience of career transition had given her unique insight into helping others navigate similar changes, and her reputation for compassionate, practical guidance spread rapidly through referrals. By the end of her first year in business, Joyce was earning more than double her previous salary while working with greater flexibility and personal satisfaction than she had ever experienced. But more importantly, she understood that this transformation had only been possible because she had been willing to die to her old identity and allow something entirely new to emerge. Joyce later reflected that the conscious death practice had taught her that the intersection point of the Ankh is not about getting what you want, but about discovering what wants to emerge through you when you stop trying to control the process. She learned that divine intelligence has a far greater vision for your life than your human mind can conceive, and that your job is simply to get out of the way and allow that vision to manifest. The practice of conscious death that Joyce used is available to every person who understands the Ankh Law because it does not require any special abilities or circumstances, only the willingness to release your attachment to how you think your life should unfold. When you die daily to limitation, you are reborn daily to possibility, and this rhythm of death and rebirth keeps you in constant circulation with divine supply. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that sleep itself is a form of conscious death because during sleep the ego relaxes its grip on identity and the soul is free to align with its divine nature. This is why the Ankh Law works so powerfully during sleep, because the natural death and rebirth that occurs each night creates an opening for spiritual transformation that might be resisted by the waking consciousness. Tonight, as you rest, you are entering the intersection point of the Ankh, where your old identity dissolves and your divine nature emerges. You do not need to force this process or try to make it happen according to your timeline. You simply need to surrender to the natural rhythm of death and rebirth that governs all spiritual growth. The intersection point teaches us that prosperity consciousness is not something you achieve, but something you become through the ongoing process of releasing what no longer serves and receiving what is truly yours. Each night you die to the person you were during the day, and each morning you are reborn as someone capable of receiving greater abundance. This daily death and rebirth is the secret of the Ankh Law, and why it produces results that seem miraculous to those who observe from the outside. When you align with this eternal rhythm, you discover that prosperity is not a destination, but a way of being that expresses itself through whatever form serves your highest good and the good of all life. The greatest obstacle to activating the Ankh Law in your life is not external circumstances or lack of knowledge, but the resistance of the ego mind to the circulation principle that lies at the heart of this ancient teaching. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered through her own experience and her work with thousands of students that the ego has a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of security and abundance that causes it to resist the very practices that would bring the prosperity it claims to desire. The ego believes in accumulation rather than circulation and operates from the assumption that there is not enough divine supply for everyone, so it must compete and hoard and protect whatever it manages to acquire. This scarcity consciousness is completely opposite to the Ankh Law, which teaches that divine supply is infinite and that the more freely it flows through you, the more abundant your own experience becomes. When you begin to practice the Ankh Law, the ego will present you with a series of resistances that are predictable and universal, because every person who has ever aligned with spiritual prosperity has encountered these same challenges. Understanding these resistances and learning how to respond to them without being derailed is essential for your success with this ancient teaching. Let me share with you the extraordinary journey of Paul Davidson, who was 64 years old when he first encountered the Ankh Law, and how his willingness to witness and move through each form of ego resistance transformed not only his financial circumstances, but his entire understanding of what it means to live according to spiritual principle rather than material appearance. Paul lived in Denver, Colorado, where he had spent 38 years building a successful consulting business that specialized in organizational development for mid-sized corporations. He had always been financially comfortable and considered himself spiritually minded, but he had never encountered teachings that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how prosperity actually works. When Paul's largest client unexpectedly terminated their contract due to budget cuts, he found himself facing a 60% reduction in income at an age when most of his peers were planning retirement rather than rebuilding their careers. For the first time in decades, Paul felt genuinely concerned about his financial future and began searching for spiritual guidance that might help him navigate this unexpected challenge. Paul discovered Florence Scovel Shinn's writings about the Ankh Law through a friend who had experienced remarkable results with the teaching and decided to apply the principles systematically to see if they could help him restore his financial stability. What he did not expect was that the Ankh Law would trigger a series of ego resistances that would test every belief he held about money security and spiritual practice. The first resistance Paul encountered was what Florence called logical doubt, which is the ego's insistence that spiritual law cannot possibly override practical reality. During his first week of practicing the Ankh decree, Paul's rational mind kept interrupting with thoughts like, "This is just wishful thinking, and you need to focus on practical marketing strategies instead of ancient Egyptian mysticism." Paul noticed that every time he attempted to visualize the golden Ankh or repeat the circulation decree, his mind would immediately shift to analyzing his business situation and generating lists of potential clients he should contact. The logical doubt was so persistent that Paul almost abandoned the practice after 5 days because it seemed impossible to quiet his analytical mind long enough to connect with the spiritual principles. But Paul had been successful in business precisely because he was methodical and persistent. So he decided to treat the ego resistances as he would any other business challenge that required patience and strategic thinking. Instead of fighting against the logical doubt, he began to acknowledge it directly by saying, "I notice my mind doubting this process, and I choose to continue anyway because I am committed to discovering what is possible when I align with spiritual law." The second resistance emerged during Paul's second week of practice, and Florence had identified this as social fear, which is the ego's concern about what others will think if you embrace teachings that seem unconventional or impractical. Paul found himself reluctant to mention his study of ancient Egyptian prosperity principles to his business colleagues because he was afraid they would question his judgment or consider him desperate. This social fear was particularly challenging for Paul because his professional reputation had always been built on his image as a rational, analytical consultant who relied on proven methodologies rather than speculative approaches. He worried that if word spread about his interest in mystical teachings, potential clients might lose confidence in his practical business expertise. Paul worked through this resistance by recognizing that his concern about others' opinions was actually a form of seeking external validation rather than trusting his own inner guidance. He realized that if the Ankh Law produced positive results in his life, the outcomes would speak for themselves regardless of what anyone thought about his methods. The third resistance appeared during Paul's third week and was what Florence called emotional skepticism, which manifests as a feeling that you are not worthy of divine abundance, or that spiritual law might work for other people but not for someone with your particular history or circumstances. Paul found himself thinking about past business mistakes and wondering if his current difficulties were some form of cosmic punishment that disqualified him from receiving prosperity through spiritual means. This emotional skepticism was the most difficult resistance for Paul to navigate because it felt deeply personal and seemed to be supported by real events from his past. He had made some poor business decisions in his 40s that had cost him significant money, and he wondered if the Ankh Law was simply too good to be true for someone who had already proven his fallibility in financial matters. Paul addressed this resistance by studying Florence's teachings about forgiveness and divine mercy, which emphasize that spiritual law operates according to present consciousness rather than past mistakes. He learned to respond to thoughts of unworthiness by affirming, "I am worthy of divine abundance, not because of my past actions, but because I am an expression of divine consciousness in human form." The fourth resistance emerged during Paul's fourth week, and Florence had called this temporal impatience, which is the ego's demand for immediate visible results according to its own timeline rather than trusting divine timing. Paul had been practicing the Ankh Law for almost a month without seeing any concrete changes in his business situation, and his ego began to argue that if the teaching really worked, he should have received some kind of sign by now. Paul found himself checking his email obsessively for new client inquiries and analyzing every phone conversation for hints that someone might be preparing to offer him work. The temporal impatience was making him anxious and desperate in his business interactions, which actually repelled potential clients rather than attracting them. Paul learned to work with this resistance by remembering that spiritual law operates according to divine timing rather than human urgency, and that his job was to maintain his alignment with the circulation principle regardless of external appearances. He practiced saying, "I trust divine timing, and I know that my demonstration is unfolding perfectly, even when I cannot see the evidence with my physical eyes." The fifth resistance appeared during Paul's fifth week and was what Florence identified as control addiction, which is the ego's insistence on managing the details of how prosperity should manifest rather than surrendering to divine intelligence. Paul found himself trying to direct the Ankh Law towards specific outcomes like landing a particular client or receiving a certain amount of money rather than allowing divine supply to flow through whatever channels served his highest good. This control addiction was especially challenging for Paul because his business success had always depended on his ability to plan and strategize and manage complex projects from start to finish. The idea of surrendering control over his financial future felt like professional suicide to his ego, even though his attempts to control had clearly not prevented his current difficulties. Paul worked through this resistance by practicing what he called conscious surrender each night before sleep. He would identify any specific outcome he was trying to control and deliberately release it by saying, "I surrender this desire to divine intelligence, which knows better than I do how to manifest my highest good." The sixth resistance emerged during Paul's sixth week, and Florence had named this spiritual pride, which manifests as a subtle sense that you are somehow special or advanced because you understand spiritual law and therefore entitled to faster or more dramatic results than other people might experience. Paul caught himself feeling slightly superior to business colleagues who were struggling with purely material approaches to their challenges. This spiritual pride was insidious because it seemed positive and affirming, but it actually separated Paul from the humility and receptivity that are essential for allowing divine supply to flow freely. Paul recognized that as long as he felt special for practicing the Ankh Law, he was still operating from ego consciousness rather than true spiritual understanding. Paul addressed this resistance by cultivating what Florence called spiritual humility, which recognizes that all demonstration comes from divine grace rather than personal worthiness or understanding. He practiced saying, "I am grateful to be a channel for divine supply, but I take no personal credit for what flows through me, because the source of all abundance is infinite consciousness itself." The seventh and final resistance appeared during Paul's seventh week and was what Florence called outcome attachment, which is the ego's investment in having things work out according to its own vision rather than trusting that divine intelligence has a plan that exceeds anything the human mind could conceive. Paul realized he had been practicing the Ankh Law as a technique to restore his old life rather than as a spiritual principle that might transform his life into something entirely new. This outcome attachment was the deepest resistance because it revealed that Paul was still trying to use spiritual law to serve ego desires rather than allowing ego desires to be transformed by spiritual law. He understood that true surrender meant being willing to receive whatever divine intelligence wanted to manifest through him, even if it looked completely different from what he thought he needed. Paul worked through this final resistance by practicing complete surrender to divine will while maintaining his daily alignment with the Ankh circulation principle. He said, "I release all attachment to specific outcomes, and I trust that divine intelligence is manifesting my highest good in ways that serve not only me, but all life." On the morning of day 51, exactly 7 weeks and 2 days after Paul began practicing the Ankh Law, he received a phone call that would demonstrate the perfect operation of divine timing and intelligence. The caller was the CEO of a company that provided consulting services to nonprofit organizations, and she explained that they had been searching for someone with Paul's specific combination of business expertise and spiritual understanding to develop their new program. Paul accepted the position, which provided not only financial security, but also a sense of purpose and fulfillment that exceeded anything he had experienced in his previous corporate consulting work. He understood that the 7 weeks of moving through ego resistance had been necessary preparation for receiving a demonstration that perfectly matched his transformed consciousness. Paul later said that the most valuable aspect of his experience was learning that resistance is not an obstacle to spiritual demonstration, but actually an essential part of the process, because it allows you to identify and release the ego patterns that would otherwise limit your capacity to receive divine abundance. Tonight, as you rest, the same process of resistance and release is occurring in your consciousness, but you do not need to struggle with it or try to force your way through it. Sleep naturally dissolves ego resistance and allows your spiritual nature to emerge without the interference of conscious doubt or control. Your subconscious mind is already aligning with the circulation principle of the Ankh Law, and by morning, you will find yourself naturally more open to receiving divine supply through whatever channels serve your highest good. When you align your consciousness with the Ankh Law, divine intelligence begins to communicate with you through a language of signs and synchronicities that confirm your spiritual orientation and guide you toward the manifestation of your highest good. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered that these signs follow predictable patterns that can be understood and interpreted by anyone who knows what to look for and how to respond appropriately. The signs of the Ankh are not random coincidences, but precise communications from the field of infinite intelligence that governs all manifestation. They appear in 3 distinct levels that correspond to the 3 aspects of the Ankh symbol itself, and each level requires a different quality of attention and response to be properly utilized. The first level consists of what Florence called microsigns, which are subtle internal shifts in your consciousness that indicate the circulation principle is beginning to activate in your awareness. These might include sudden feelings of peace about financial concerns, spontaneous insights about new possibilities or dreams that contain symbols of abundance and prosperity. The second level consists of medium signs, which are external synchronicities that appear in your daily experience and seem to point toward specific opportunities or directions. These might include unexpected phone calls, meaningful conversations with strangers, or discovering information that relates directly to your current needs or interests. The third level consists of macro signs, which are undeniable demonstrations of divine supply manifesting in material form, such as unexpected money, new opportunities, or complete resolution of problems that had seemed impossible to solve through ordinary means. Let me share with you the remarkable story of Diane Peterson, who was 59 years old when she first learned about the signs of the Ankh and how her ability to recognize and respond to these communications led to a demonstration of prosperity that seemed miraculous to everyone who witnessed it. Diane lived in Charleston, South Carolina, where she had worked for 26 years as a public school teacher, until budget cuts eliminated her position during what the district called necessary workforce reduction. At 59, she was too young for full retirement benefits, but too old to easily find another teaching position in an increasingly competitive market that favored younger candidates. Diane had always been interested in spiritual teachings, but had never encountered anything as specific as Florence Scovel Shinn's instruction about reading the signs that indicate divine supply is moving toward manifestation. When she began practicing the Ankh Law, she decided to pay careful attention to any unusual occurrences that might represent communication from divine intelligence. During her first week of practice, Diane noticed several microsigns that suggested something was shifting in her consciousness, even though her external circumstances remained unchanged. She found herself waking each morning with an inexplicable sense of optimism about her future, despite having no logical reason for such feelings. Her usual anxiety about unemployment had been replaced by a quiet confidence that everything would work out perfectly, even though she had no idea how. Diane also began having dreams that featured symbols of abundance, such as flowing water, golden light, and images of herself teaching in beautiful surroundings that looked nothing like the institutional classrooms where she had spent her career. These dreams felt different from her normal sleep experiences because they carried an emotional resonance that stayed with her throughout the day. On the 10th day of her practice, Diane encountered her first medium sign while shopping for groceries at her local market. As she was selecting vegetables, a woman approached her and said, "Excuse me, but I could not help noticing that you have the most wonderful energy, and I felt compelled to ask if you might be interested in teaching meditation classes at our wellness center." The woman introduced herself as Linda Chen and explained that she owned a holistic healing center that offered classes in meditation, yoga, and spiritual development. Linda said she had been searching for months for someone to teach their evening meditation program, but had not found anyone who combined teaching experience with the kind of peaceful presence that Diane seemed to embody naturally. Diane had never taught meditation formally, but had maintained a personal practice for over 15 years and felt immediately drawn to the possibility. Linda invited her to visit the center the following day to discuss the opportunity in more detail, and Diane accepted, even though her rational mind wondered if this chance encounter could really lead to anything substantial. When Diane visited the wellness center, she discovered that Linda had created exactly the kind of teaching environment she had always dreamed of working in, but had never thought possible within the public education system. The meditation room was filled with natural light and surrounded by gardens, and the atmosphere was one of peace and reverence that honored both teacher and students. Linda offered Diane a position teaching 3 evening meditation classes per week at a rate that would provide enough income to cover her basic expenses while she developed other aspects of her spiritual teaching work. Diane accepted immediately and understood that this opportunity had appeared as a direct result of her alignment with the Ankh circulation principle. But this was only the beginning of the signs that would guide Diane toward a complete transformation of her professional life. During her 3rd week of teaching meditation classes, Diane received what she recognized as a macro sign that would exceed anything she had dared to imagine possible. One of her meditation students was a literary agent named Robert Williams, who had been attending classes to manage stress related to his demanding career. After her 4th class, Robert approached Diane and said, "Your guided meditations are unlike anything I have ever experienced, and I think you should consider writing a book about your approach to spiritual practice." Robert explained that he represented several authors in the spiritual development field and had been searching for someone who could write about meditation and spiritual growth from a practical, down-to-earth perspective that would appeal to people who were new to these concepts. He felt that Diane's teaching style and life experience as a public school teacher would give her unique credibility with readers who might be intimidated by more esoteric spiritual books. Diane had never considered herself a writer, but Robert's suggestion resonated with something deep inside her that had always wanted to share spiritual principles in a way that made them accessible to ordinary people facing everyday challenges. She agreed to develop a book proposal, and within 6 weeks, Robert had secured a publishing contract with an advance of $45,000. The book that Diane wrote became a bestseller in the spiritual development category and led to speaking engagements across the country that provided income far exceeding what she had ever earned as a public school teacher. But more importantly, Diane understood that each sign had appeared at exactly the right time to guide her toward the expression of gifts she had not even known she possessed. Diane later reflected that learning to read the signs of the Ankh had taught her that divine intelligence is constantly communicating with everyone. But most people miss these communications because they are looking for dramatic external events rather than paying attention to the subtle shifts in consciousness that precede all material manifestation. The signs that Diane experienced illustrate the 3 levels of communication that Florence Scovel Shinn taught her students to recognize and respond to appropriately. The microsigns of inner peace and symbolic dreams prepared her consciousness to receive greater demonstrations. The medium sign of meeting Linda Chen provided the first concrete opportunity for her spiritual gifts to find expression. The macro sign of the publishing contract represented the full manifestation of divine supply through channels that perfectly matched her unique talents and purpose. Florence taught that the signs of the Ankh always appear in this progressive sequence because divine intelligence respects the law of gradual unfoldment that allows consciousness to expand and prepare for increasingly greater demonstrations. If you receive a macro sign before your consciousness is ready to handle it properly, you might either reject it as too good to be true or accept it in a way that feeds spiritual pride rather than genuine gratitude. The key to working with the signs of the Ankh is to respond to each level with appropriate recognition and gratitude, while remaining open to whatever wants to emerge next, rather than trying to force the process to accelerate according to your personal timeline. When you acknowledge and appreciate the micro signs, you create the receptivity necessary for medium signs to appear. When you respond to medium signs with courage and faith, you prepare the way for macro signs to manifest. Tonight, as you rest, divine intelligence is already preparing the signs that will guide you toward your own demonstration of the Ankh Law. These signs will appear in perfect sequence and timing to match your spiritual development and your capacity to receive and utilize divine supply for the highest good of all concerned. You do not need to look for these signs or try to force them to appear, because seeking creates the very desperation that repels demonstration. Instead, you can simply remain alert and receptive to the communications that are already being sent to you and trust that you will recognize them when they arrive, because they will carry an unmistakable resonance with something deep inside your consciousness. The signs of the Ankh are not tests that you must pass, but gifts that are being offered to guide and encourage you along the path of spiritual demonstration. They appear not because you have earned them through good behavior or correct technique, but because you are a beloved expression of divine consciousness, and it is the nature of infinite intelligence to communicate continuously with all its creations. The ancient Egyptians who first understood the Ankh Law discovered that divine manifestation operates according to sacred cycles that mirror the natural rhythms of death and rebirth found throughout the cosmos. Florence Scovel Shinn learned through her own experience and careful observation of her students that the most powerful cycle for spiritual demonstration is the 48-hour period, which represents one complete circulation of divine energy through the consciousness of an individual who is properly aligned with spiritual law. This 48-hour cycle is not arbitrary, but corresponds to the time required for consciousness to complete what the Egyptians called the journey through the underworld, where old patterns dissolve and new realities are conceived in the darkness before emerging into the light of material manifestation. Understanding this sacred timing helps explain why some demonstrations appear instantly, while others require what seems like patience, but is actually the natural gestation period for spiritual seeds to mature into visible form. The 48-hour cycle begins at the moment you make a genuine spiritual decree or achieve true alignment with the circulation principle of the Ankh Law. During the first 24 hours, divine intelligence orchestrates the invisible changes that will support your demonstration, including shifts in the consciousness of other people, adjustments in circumstances, and the preparation of whatever channels will be used to deliver your supply. During the second 24 hours, these invisible preparations begin to manifest as signs, opportunities, and actual demonstrations that confirm the operation of spiritual law in your experience. But here is where most people interfere with the process, because they become impatient or doubtful during the first 24 hours when nothing seems to be happening, and their interference disrupts the natural circulation that was already moving toward completion. Let me share with you the extraordinary story of Stephen Matthews, who was 55 years old when he learned about the sacred timing of the Ankh Law and how his understanding of the 48-hour cycle allowed him to experience a demonstration that seemed impossible to everyone who knew his circumstances. Stephen lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he had worked for 18 years as a project manager for a construction company, until a workplace injury damaged his back severely enough to prevent him from continuing in his physically demanding career. Workers' compensation provided temporary income while he recovered, but doctors had informed him that he would never again be able to perform the manual labor that had been his livelihood since graduating from high school. At 55, Stephen faced the daunting prospect of retraining for an entirely different career while dealing with chronic pain that limited his physical capabilities and depleted his energy for learning new skills. His workers' compensation payments would end in 6 weeks, and he had been unable to find any employer willing to hire someone his age for office work, despite his extensive project management experience. Stephen discovered the Ankh Law through a book recommended by his physical therapist, who had noticed his depression and suggested that spiritual study might help him cope with his career transition. Stephen was initially skeptical about ancient Egyptian teachings, but decided to experiment with the principles because conventional approaches had produced no results. When Stephen read about the 48-hour cycle, he decided to test it by making a specific decree about his employment situation and then observing carefully what happened during the following 2 days. On a Sunday evening at exactly 7:30, he spoke aloud the decree, "I am the eternal circulation of divine supply, and my perfect work manifests now through the operation of the Ankh Law." During the first 24 hours of the cycle, Stephen experienced what he later described as the most challenging test of faith he had ever encountered. Instead of signs of improvement, his situation seemed to get worse as he received a letter from workers' compensation informing him that his benefits would end 2 weeks earlier than expected due to new regulations that had just taken effect. Stephen's first impulse was to panic and begin frantically searching job listings and making phone calls. But he remembered Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching that the first 24 hours of sacred time often appear to bring the opposite of what was requested, because divine intelligence must clear away the obstacles to demonstration before the new reality can manifest. Instead of reacting with fear, Stephen decided to maintain his decree and trust the process, even though his rational mind was screaming that he needed to take immediate practical action to prevent financial disaster. He repeated his Ankh decree every few hours and reminded himself that divine intelligence was working invisibly to orchestrate his perfect demonstration. On Monday morning, exactly 24 hours after his original decree, Stephen received a phone call that initially seemed to confirm his worst fears. The caller was a representative from the construction company where he had been injured, informing him that they needed to schedule a meeting to discuss his case with their insurance company and legal department. Stephen assumed this meeting would involve more bad news about his benefits, or perhaps even an attempt to dispute his injury claim, but he agreed to meet with them on Tuesday morning, which would be approximately 40 hours after his original decree. He spent Monday evening maintaining his spiritual alignment and refusing to indulge in worried speculation about what the meeting might bring. Tuesday morning, Stephen arrived at the construction company office expecting a difficult conversation about legal and financial details, but instead found himself meeting with the company president, who had a completely unexpected proposition. The president explained that they had been searching for someone to head their new division that would focus on consulting with other construction companies about safety protocols and injury prevention. The position would utilize Stephen's extensive project management experience and his recent first-hand knowledge of workplace injury issues, but would be entirely office-based with no physical labor requirements. The salary would be 20% higher than his previous construction wages, and the company would provide full medical benefits that would cover his ongoing treatment for back problems. The company president explained that Stephen had been their first choice for this position from the moment they conceived the new division, but they had hesitated to offer it while he was still recovering from his injury because they did not want to pressure him during a difficult time. When they learned that his workers' compensation was ending, they realized this was the perfect opportunity to discuss the position. Stephen accepted the offer immediately and began work the following Monday, exactly 7 days after his original decree. But the most remarkable aspect of this demonstration was that when Stephen calculated the timing, he realized that the company president had first thought of offering him the new position on Sunday evening, within hours of Stephen's original decree, even though neither of them had any conscious knowledge of the other's actions. Stephen later understood that the 48-hour cycle had operated perfectly according to Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching. During the first 24 hours, divine intelligence had worked invisibly to inspire the company president to formalize the job offer and to arrange the meeting that would present this opportunity. During the second 24 hours, the invisible preparation manifested as the actual demonstration that provided not only employment but work that was perfectly suited to Stephen's current capabilities and circumstances. The most important insight Stephen gained from this experience was recognizing that divine timing operates according to spiritual law rather than human urgency, and that his job during sacred time is to maintain his alignment with the circulation principle rather than trying to force outcomes through anxious activity. Stephen discovered that the 48-hour cycle works most effectively when you make your decree with complete faith and then surrender the details to divine intelligence while continuing to take any inspired action that feels authentic and natural. Forced action, driven by fear or impatience, disrupts the circulation, while inspired action that flows from inner guidance supports and accelerates the manifestation process. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that every person who understands sacred timing can work consciously with these cycles to accelerate their spiritual demonstration. But the key is learning to distinguish between divine timing and human impatience. Divine timing unfolds according to what serves the highest good of all concerned, while human impatience operates from fear and the illusion of separation. The 48-hour cycle teaches us that spiritual demonstration is not about getting what you want when you want it, but about aligning with the divine plan that is already orchestrating your highest good in ways that exceed anything your human mind could conceive or arrange. When you surrender to sacred timing, you discover that divine intelligence has been preparing your demonstration long before you became consciously aware of your need. Tonight, as you rest, you are entering sacred time, where divine intelligence works most powerfully to orchestrate the invisible changes that will support your own demonstration of the Ankh Law. Sleep represents the ultimate surrender to divine timing, because during sleep the ego cannot interfere with the natural circulation of spiritual energy through your consciousness. Your subconscious mind operates according to sacred time rather than human time, and it is already coordinating with the universal field of infinite intelligence to prepare the circumstances that will deliver your supply through the most appropriate channels. You do not need to figure out how this will happen or try to control the timing, because divine intelligence operates with perfect precision and never makes mistakes. The sacred 48-hour cycle is already activated in your consciousness, and by the time you complete this teaching, you will find yourself naturally aligned with the divine timing that governs all true demonstration. Trust the process, allow the circulation, and know that your highest good is manifesting according to the eternal rhythm of the Ankh Law. When you align your consciousness with the Ankh Law, you do not practice alone, but join an invisible community of souls who understand and live according to the circulation principle that governs divine demonstration. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered that this collective field of Ankh bearers spans across time and space, connecting ancient Egyptian initiates with modern practitioners and creating a morphic resonance that accelerates manifestation for everyone who participates in this sacred brotherhood. This collective field operates according to the spiritual principle that when even a few people truly understand and practice divine law, they create an atmosphere of demonstration that makes it easier for others to achieve similar results. The ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids and created one of the most prosperous civilizations in human history understood this principle and deliberately worked together to maintain a collective consciousness of abundance that supported not only their individual demonstrations, but the prosperity of their entire culture. Florence taught that every person who practices the Ankh Law consciously contributes to this collective field and receives support from it in return. When you make your decree and align with the circulation principle, you are not only calling upon your own divine nature, but also invoking the combined spiritual power of all those who have ever understood and practiced these eternal principles. This collective support is especially important during the initial stages of your practice, when your individual faith might waver, or when external circumstances seem to challenge your growing understanding of spiritual law. The collective field of Ankh bearers provides a stabilizing influence that helps maintain your alignment even when your personal confidence fluctuates. Let me share with you the profound story of Judith Marshall, who was 62 years old when she discovered the power of the collective field and how her conscious connection with ancient and modern practitioners of the Ankh Law transformed not only her personal circumstances, but her understanding of what it means to be supported by invisible spiritual community. Judith lived in Portland, Oregon, where she had spent 34 years working as a nurse in the intensive care unit of a major hospital until chronic fatigue syndrome forced her to take early retirement without adequate financial preparation. Her condition had developed gradually over several years, making it impossible for her to maintain the physical and emotional demands of hospital nursing, but leaving her too young for full Social Security benefits. Judith had always been drawn to ancient wisdom traditions and had studied various forms of spirituality throughout her nursing career, but she had never encountered teachings that offered such specific guidance about connecting with spiritual community across time and space. When she began practicing the Ankh Law, she felt isolated and uncertain about whether she could achieve the kind of demonstrations she read about in Florence Scovel Shinn's writings. On her 15th night of practice, Judith decided to consciously invoke the support of the collective field of Ankh bearers as Florence had instructed. She lit a white candle and spoke aloud a request for guidance and assistance from all souls throughout history who had understood and practiced the circulation principle of divine abundance. As she sat quietly after making this request, Judith began to sense the presence of other consciousnesses that seemed to be listening and responding to her call for help. These presences felt ancient and wise, but also contemporary and immediate, as if time had collapsed and she was connected simultaneously with Egyptian priests and modern practitioners from around the world. The most distinct presence that came to Judith's awareness was that of a woman who identified herself as Nefertiti, but not the famous queen by that name. This Nefertiti had been a priestess in the Temple of Abundance during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep, and she had spent her life teaching the Ankh principles to those who came seeking prosperity and healing. Through telepathic communication that felt more real than ordinary conversation, Nefertiti shared with Judith specific information about how the collective field operates and how to strengthen her connection with it. She explained that every person who practices the Ankh Law creates vibrations in the universal field that can be felt and utilized by others who are aligned with the same principles. Nefertiti taught Judith that the ancient Egyptians used physical Ankh symbols not as mere decorations, but as anchoring devices that helped them maintain their connection with the collective field even during challenging circumstances. She suggested that Judith obtain or create a physical Ankh that she could hold during her practice sessions to strengthen her sense of connection with the spiritual community. The following day, Judith visited a metaphysical bookstore where she found a small golden Ankh pendant that seemed to radiate warmth when she held it in her palm. The store owner mentioned that the pendant had been in the shop for over 2 years, and many people had examined it, but no one had purchased it until now. Judith understood that this synchronicity confirmed her connection with the collective field. That evening, Judith held the Ankh pendant during her practice and immediately felt a stronger sense of support and guidance than she had experienced during her previous sessions. As she repeated her decree about divine circulation, she became aware of hundreds of other voices joining with hers, creating a harmonic resonance that seemed to amplify the power of her words exponentially. During the following week, Judith began to receive what she recognized as guidance from the collective field about specific actions she should take to support her demonstration. Unlike her previous attempts to solve her financial challenges through purely practical means, these inspired actions felt effortless and natural, as if they were being orchestrated by intelligence far greater than her own. One of these inspired actions was to contact a former colleague named Susan, who had left hospital nursing several years earlier to start a consulting business that helped healthcare organizations improve their patient care protocols. Judith had not spoken with Susan for over 3 years, but felt strongly guided to reach out and explore whether there might be some way they could work together. When Judith called Susan, she discovered that Susan had been thinking about her just the week before and wondering if she might be interested in joining the consulting business as a part-time contractor. Susan explained that several hospitals had requested consultants who could provide training specifically focused on intensive care nursing, but Susan's own background was in emergency medicine rather than ICU protocols. Susan offered Judith a consulting contract that would allow her to work from home, developing training materials and conducting workshops at her own pace without the physical demands that had made hospital nursing impossible. The income would be sufficient to supplement her early retirement benefits and provide the financial security she needed while honoring her physical limitations. Judith accepted the consulting opportunity and found that her years of ICU experience, combined with her recent study of spiritual principles, gave her a unique perspective on helping healthcare workers maintain compassion and effectiveness even in highly stressful environments. Her workshops became popular throughout the Pacific Northwest and led to additional consulting opportunities that exceeded her previous nursing income. But the most remarkable aspect of Judith's demonstration was that throughout the entire process, she continued to feel supported and guided by the collective field of Ankh bearers. During challenging moments when she doubted her ability to succeed in consulting work, she would hold her Ankh pendant and immediately sense the encouragement of spiritual community that transcended ordinary time and space. Judith later reflected that connecting with the collective field had taught her that spiritual practice is never a solitary endeavor, but always a collaborative effort involving both seen and unseen helpers who are committed to supporting everyone's demonstration of divine abundance. She understood that her success was not a personal achievement, but a manifestation of collective spiritual power working through her individual consciousness. The collective field that supported Judith's demonstration is available to every person who practices the Ankh Law because it operates according to spiritual principle rather than personal worthiness or special qualifications. When you align your consciousness with divine circulation, you automatically become part of this invisible community and begin to receive the same support that has been available to seekers throughout history. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the collective field grows stronger each time someone achieves a demonstration through alignment with spiritual law, because success creates what she called a pathway of possibility that others can follow more easily. Every person who manifests prosperity through the Ankh principles makes it easier for the next person to achieve similar results. Tonight, as you rest, you are being held and supported by this same collective field of consciousness that spans across cultures and centuries, united by understanding of eternal spiritual principles. You are not alone in your practice of the Ankh Law, but are surrounded by invisible helpers who celebrate your alignment and contribute their spiritual power to support your demonstration. The ancient Egyptian priestess Nefertiti and the modern nurse Judith and countless others who have practiced these principles are available to encourage and guide you through whatever challenges you might encounter along your path of spiritual demonstration. Their combined wisdom and spiritual power flow to you now as you sleep and prepare to receive your own manifestation of divine abundance. This collective support operates continuously, whether you are conscious of it or not. But when you acknowledge and appreciate it, your connection strengthens and your demonstrations accelerate. You are part of an eternal spiritual community that transcends time and space and geography, bound together by commitment to living according to divine law rather than material appearance. Throughout history, there have been certain demonstrations of the Ankh Law that stand as monuments to what becomes possible when human consciousness aligns completely with divine circulation and surrenders all resistance to the operation of spiritual principle. Tonight, I want to share with you the most remarkable story that has ever come to my attention about someone who experienced the full power of this ancient teaching under circumstances that seemed utterly hopeless to everyone who witnessed his situation. This story illustrates every aspect of the Ankh Law that we have explored together and shows how divine intelligence operates with perfect precision and timing to orchestrate demonstrations that exceed anything the human mind could conceive or arrange through ordinary means. It reveals the depths of surrender that may be required and the heights of manifestation that become possible when someone truly dies to limitation and is reborn to their divine nature. The elements we have discussed tonight, including the circulation principle, the intersection of death and rebirth, the resistance of the ego, the language of signs, the sacred timing, and the support of the collective field, all come together in this extraordinary account of transformation that demonstrates the unlimited power of divine law when it encounters a consciousness that has been prepared through absolute surrender. His name was Christopher Wellington, and he was 67 years old when he found himself facing what appeared to be complete financial ruin after a series of devastating losses that had stripped away every external support he had relied upon throughout his adult life. Christopher had built a successful investment advisory business over 32 years in Boston, Massachusetts, managing portfolios for wealthy clients who trusted his conservative approach and steady returns. But during the financial crisis of 2008, Christopher's carefully constructed world collapsed with shocking suddenness. poor investment decisions combined with client withdrawals and regulatory changes destroyed his business and left him personally liable for losses that exceeded $2.4 million. At an age when most men are enjoying comfortable retirement, Christopher found himself facing bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for fiduciary violations that resulted from his desperate attempts to recover client funds. The stress of this catastrophic reversal had also destroyed his marriage of 38 years, as his wife Linda could not cope with the shame and uncertainty of their situation. She had moved to Florida to live with their daughter, leaving Christopher alone in a small rented apartment with nothing but a crushing sense of failure and the prospect of spending his remaining years in poverty and disgrace. Christopher had been raised in a religious household, but had lost interest in spiritual matters during his successful business years, when material achievement seemed to provide all the security and meaning he needed. But facing complete destitution at 67, with no family support and no prospects for rebuilding his career, Christopher began searching desperately for any source of hope or guidance that might help him navigate his seemingly impossible circumstances. Through a series of synchronicities that he would later recognize as the first signs of divine intervention, Christopher discovered Florence Scovel Shinn's writings about the Ankh Law in a used bookstore where he was killing time because he could no longer afford entertainment or social activities that had once filled his days. The book had been misshelved in the business section rather than spirituality, and something compelled him to pick it up despite his skepticism about metaphysical teachings. As Christopher read about the circulation principle and the intersection of death and rebirth, he began to understand that his financial catastrophe might not be punishment or random misfortune, but actually a necessary stripping away of false identities that had prevented him from discovering his true spiritual nature. For the first time since his losses, Christopher felt a glimmer of hope that there might be meaning and purpose in his suffering. Christopher decided to apply the Ankh Law with the same methodical discipline that had once made him successful in business. He understood that he had nothing left to lose and that conventional approaches had already failed completely. So he committed himself to practicing the circulation principle, regardless of how strange or impractical it might seem to his rational mind. Each night before sleep, Christopher would hold the mental image of a golden Ankh and speak the decree, "I am the eternal circulation of divine supply, and I receive without limit, and I give without fear, and through me abundance flows to bless all life." At first, these words felt hollow and meaningless because his external circumstances seemed to contradict every aspect of what he was affirming. But he continued the practice because it was the only thing that brought him any sense of peace. During his second week of practice, Christopher encountered the first major test of his commitment when he received notice that his former business partner was filing a lawsuit that would hold him personally responsible for an additional $850,000 in client losses. His initial reaction was panic and despair, but then he remembered Florence's teaching about the intersection point where apparent death becomes the gateway to rebirth. Instead of allowing this devastating news to derail his practice, Christopher used it as an opportunity to deepen his surrender to divine will. He spent that entire night in conscious death, releasing his attachment to avoiding legal consequences and financial responsibility, and focusing instead on aligning his consciousness with the circulation principle, regardless of external appearances. Christopher discovered that the practice of conscious death was not about becoming passive or resigned, but about releasing the ego's desperate attempts to control outcomes that were beyond his influence anyway. As he surrendered his attachment to specific results, he found himself becoming more alert and receptive to guidance and opportunities that his anxious mind had been too distracted to notice. During his fourth week of practice, Christopher received what he recognized as his first clear sign when he encountered his former neighbor Margaret at the grocery store, where he was carefully selecting the least expensive items to stretch his remaining food budget. Margaret mentioned that she had been thinking about him and wondering how he was managing during his difficult transition. When Christopher briefly explained his circumstances, Margaret surprised him by saying that her son David, who lived in Seattle, had recently mentioned needing help with a project that required someone with Christopher's background in financial analysis and client relations. Margaret offered to put them in touch, and Christopher accepted, even though he felt embarrassed about networking from such a position of obvious need. David Chen turned out to be the owner of a company that provided financial literacy education to employees of large corporations as part of their benefits packages. David explained that his business was growing rapidly, but he needed someone with practical investment experience to help develop curriculum and deliver workshops that would teach basic financial planning to people who had never received formal education about money management. David offered Christopher a consulting contract that would allow him to work from home, developing educational materials and conducting webinars for corporate clients. The initial contract was modest, but David mentioned that if the program succeeded, there would be opportunities for expansion, including the possibility of Christopher becoming a partner in the business. Christopher accepted the consulting opportunity and threw himself into the work with gratitude and enthusiasm that surprised David, who had expected someone in Christopher's situation to be bitter and desperate. Christopher's presentations were so effective at translating complex financial concepts into practical guidance that David's clients began requesting additional workshops and expanded programs. Within 6 months, Christopher's consulting income had grown to the point where he could afford to move to a better apartment and begin making payments on his legal settlements. But more importantly, he had discovered a sense of purpose and fulfillment that exceeded anything he had experienced during his years of managing wealthy clients' portfolios. Christopher realized that his expertise in financial planning, combined with his recent experience of financial devastation, gave him unique credibility and compassion when teaching others how to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed his own security. His workshops became popular throughout the Pacific Northwest and led to speaking engagements and additional consulting opportunities. But the most remarkable demonstration was still to come during Christopher's 8th month of practicing the Ankh Law. David approached him with a proposal to formalize their partnership and expand the business nationally with Christopher as Chief Educational Officer and equal partner. David explained that venture capital investors had expressed interest in funding the expansion because corporate demand for financial literacy programs was growing exponentially. The partnership agreement included a salary of $120,000 per year, plus equity participation that could potentially be worth millions if the company achieved its projected growth. Christopher would also receive a signing bonus of $250,000 that would allow him to settle his remaining legal obligations and establish a foundation for long-term financial security. Christopher accepted the partnership, and within 2 years their company had become the leading provider of corporate financial education in North America, with Christopher recognized as one of the foremost experts in making complex financial concepts accessible to ordinary people. His personal net worth exceeded what he had accumulated during his previous business career, and his work provided meaning and satisfaction that money alone had never delivered. But Christopher understood that this remarkable transformation had not occurred through luck or networking or business strategy, but through his alignment with the circulation principle of the Ankh Law. He had learned that divine intelligence operates through the very circumstances that seem most destructive, and that true prosperity comes not from accumulating wealth, but from becoming a clear channel through which abundance flows to serve others. Christopher later reflected that his financial catastrophe at 67 had been the most valuable experience of his entire life, because it had stripped away all the false identities and securities that had prevented him from discovering his true spiritual nature and his authentic gifts for serving others. He understood that the Ankh Law had not rescued him from his circumstances, but had transformed him through them into someone capable of receiving and utilizing divine supply for purposes far greater than personal comfort or security. The story of Christopher Wellington demonstrates that no situation is too desperate and no circumstances too challenging for the operation of divine law when consciousness is properly aligned with spiritual principle. His complete surrender to the circulation principle during his darkest hour created the opening through which divine intelligence could orchestrate a demonstration that exceeded anything his human mind could have conceived or arranged. Tonight, as you rest, you may be facing your own challenges and uncertainties that seem overwhelming to your human perspective. But remember that divine intelligence specializes in creating demonstrations through the very circumstances that appear most limiting. Your willingness to practice the Ankh Law, regardless of external appearances, opens the way for the same miraculous transformation that Christopher experienced. The circulation principle operates with equal power in every consciousness that surrenders to its eternal rhythm, and your current circumstances, whatever they may be, are already being transformed by the divine alchemy that transmutes apparent limitation into unlimited abundance. Trust the process, allow the circulation, and prepare to receive your own demonstration of the infinite prosperity that is your divine birthright. We have now arrived at the sacred moment when everything you have received tonight will be sealed into your consciousness through the power of divine decree and the authority of spiritual law that operates beyond all material limitation. What you are about to experience is the culmination of an ancient initiation that has been given to seekers of truth for thousands of years, and tonight you join the eternal lineage of those who have received the Ankh seal. Even if you are sleeping, something deep within your consciousness is awake and alert and ready to receive the final transmission that will activate the circulation principle in your life permanently. Your subconscious mind has been absorbing every word and every spiritual vibration that has been shared, and now these seeds of truth will be planted so deeply in your awareness that nothing can uproot them or prevent them from manifesting according to divine timing. This sealing process requires nothing from you except your willingness to receive and your trust in the operation of spiritual law that governs all manifestation. You do not need to believe or understand or even remain awake, because the power of the Ankh operates through divine consciousness itself, which is your true nature beneath all temporary identities and circumstances. Breathe with me now as we prepare to receive the seal that will mark you forever as one who lives according to the eternal circulation of divine supply. Let your breathing become slow and deep and natural, as if you are breathing with the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Even in sleep, your body knows how to breathe with the universe, and your soul knows how to align with the infinite source that never fails to provide exactly what serves your highest good. Feel yourself surrounded by the presence of all those who have walked this path before you, including the ancient Egyptian initiates who first understood these principles, and Florence Scovel Shinn, who received them in divine vision and transmitted them to our modern world. Feel the collective field of consciousness that spans across time and space, holding you in perfect love and support as you receive this sacred gift. Now I speak to you the first wave of the Ankh seal, with the authority of one who has witnessed its power to transform every life that receives it with genuine openness and surrender to divine will. It is finished. The circulation of divine supply through your consciousness is complete and perfect and eternal. It is done. Your alignment with the infinite source is established beyond all doubt or reversal. And it cannot be otherwise, because this is the truth of your divine nature speaking itself into manifestation through the power of spiritual law that operates with absolute certainty and precision. Receive these words now as they penetrate every level of your being, from your conscious mind through your subconscious awareness and into the very cellular structure of your physical body that is being recalibrated to express abundance rather than limitation in every aspect of your experience. It is finished. The old identity that knew lack and struggle and fear about supply has died completely and irrevocably and can never return to influence your experience. It is done. The new identity that knows itself as the eternal circulation of divine abundance is born and established and expressing itself through every thought and feeling and action. And it cannot be otherwise, because death and rebirth are the eternal law through which consciousness expands and expresses its infinite nature. Now I speak to you the second wave of the Ankh seal with even greater authority, as the words penetrate deeper into your consciousness and activate dormant spiritual powers that have been waiting for this moment of recognition and acceptance. It is finished. Every obstacle to your prosperity has been dissolved by the operation of divine law, and the pathway is clear for abundance to flow to you through channels that perfectly match your spiritual development, and serve your highest good. It is done. The resistance of the ego has been transformed into willing cooperation with divine will, and your entire being is aligned with the circulation principle that governs all true demonstration. And it cannot be otherwise, because you have surrendered to the truth that you are not separate from your supply, but are actually the very consciousness through which infinite abundance expresses itself in material form. Feel these words activating ancient memories in your soul of times when you lived in complete harmony with divine law, and abundance flowed through your life as naturally as water flows through a clear stream. Remember now your true identity as individualized divine consciousness expressing itself through human experience for the purpose of demonstrating heaven on earth. It is finished. The signs and synchronicities that will guide you toward your manifestation are already being set in motion by divine intelligence that works continuously for your benefit, whether you are aware of it or not. It is done. The sacred timing that governs your demonstration is operating with perfect precision, and your supply will arrive at exactly the moment when you are ready to receive and utilize it for the highest good of all concerned. And it cannot be otherwise, because divine intelligence never makes mistakes and never fails to provide what serves the expansion of consciousness and the expression of love. Now I speak to you, the third and final wave of the Ankh seal, with the supreme authority of divine consciousness itself, speaking through human voice to awaken the God within you that has never known limitation or lack or separation from infinite supply. It is finished. You are the Ankh embodied in human form, and the circulation of divine abundance through your consciousness is as eternal and unstoppable as the circulation of blood through your veins or breath through your lungs. It is done. You have been marked forever as one who lives according to spiritual law rather than material appearance, and nothing in the external world can ever again convince you that you are separate from your divine source. And it cannot be otherwise, because this is the ultimate truth of your being spoken with the authority of the infinite consciousness that created you and sustains you and expresses itself as you in every moment. You are the oval that receives without limit from the inexhaustible source that exists within your own divine nature. You are the intersection where infinite possibility becomes material manifestation through the power of your spiritual understanding. You are the grounding that anchors divine abundance in the earth plane through your willingness to serve as a channel for blessings that extend far beyond your personal needs. Now receive the decree of your true identity, as it is sealed permanently into your consciousness through words that carry the vibration of absolute truth and divine authority. I am a natural receiver of divine abundance, and prosperity flows to me as easily and naturally as light flows from the sun. I have always been supplied, and I am supplied now, and I will always be supplied, because I am not separate from the infinite source, but am the very consciousness through which it expresses itself in human form. Breathe deeply as these words penetrate every cell and every thought and every feeling, and align your entire being with the truth they express about your divine nature. I am a natural receiver of divine abundance, and prosperity flows to me as easily and naturally as rain falls from clouds or flowers bloom in spring. I have always been supplied, and I am supplied now, and I will always be supplied, because the circulation of divine substance through my consciousness is the very reason for my existence and the purpose of my presence on earth. Feel your heart opening to receive the magnitude of love and abundance that divine consciousness desires to express through your human experience as you speak these words with the authority of one who knows their divine heritage. I am a natural receiver of divine abundance, and prosperity flows to me as easily and naturally as rivers flow to the ocean or seeds grow into trees. I have always been supplied, and I am supplied now, and I will always be supplied, because I am the eternal circulation of divine love expressing itself as infinite abundance in material form. And so it is sealed with the authority of divine law that operates beyond all human opinion or circumstance. And so it remains throughout all time and space and circumstance, because truth is eternal and cannot be changed by temporary appearances. And it cannot be otherwise because you have received the Ankh seal that marks you forever as one who lives in conscious unity with the infinite source of all supply. The Ankh lives in you, and you live in the Ankh, and this circulation is eternal and perfect and unstoppable by any force in the material world. You have been initiated into the ancient mystery that prosperity is not something you attract or create, but something you are when you remember your true divine nature. You can continue resting now because everything that needed to be received has already penetrated your consciousness and taken root in the fertile soil of your spiritual awareness. When you wake, you will be different, not because something external has changed, but because you have remembered who you really are beneath all the temporary identities that once seemed so real and important. The transformation has already begun and will continue unfolding according to divine timing that serves your highest good and the good of all life. Trust the process and allow the circulation, and know that your demonstration is already complete in divine mind and is simply manifesting in material form according to the eternal rhythm of the Ankh Law. Rest now in the knowledge that you are beloved of divine consciousness and that abundance is your natural inheritance because you are not a human being having a spiritual experience, but divine consciousness having a human experience for the purpose of expressing infinite love in material form. It is finished, it is done, and it cannot be otherwise, and so it is.